Hello and welcome to yet another special broadcast of News 9 Plus at Raisina Dialogue 2023. We've been discussing several key issues, including the G20 summit that is happening later this year, and of course the Foreign Affairs Ministers meeting where the consensus was not achieved, but this important Raisina Dialogue is happening in the backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and of course several key issues. And joining us today is another prominent personality, Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, who has been a diplomat for over 3 decades and importantly served in the United Nations as well. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us. I want to begin by asking you on the Raisina Dialogue itself, and India's key position globally. How important and significant is this event, Raisina Dialogue? And in the last many years, even as we have seen this journey of India arriving at the global stage under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, we've also seen Raisina Dialogue growing from strength to strength.
I think it's very important for a rising India, and an India which, as Prime Minister Modi has dreamt of, is aiming to become a developed country by 2047, and the Amrit Kaal has begun. In that context, absolutely necessary that we have our own this particular session or this particular year, the theme is lighthouse in the tempest. So we must have our think tanks who are global to also establish our Vishwaguru role, and this dialogue is a way of bringing together other think tanks, to bring together diplomats, politicians, people from different callings, to share their ideas, but also to take away from India its own wisdom on various global issues, as well as to get an idea of where India is in its trajectory on its path to greatness. I think that is the significance of the Raisina Dialogue, and also taking stock and to also show progress, because I met some people who had come 2 years ago, since COVID interrupted, but I met some of them and they said, every year we come, there is change, there is progress, and they are amazed. And we need to increase that circle of influence and friends of India in all capitals, and this is a very good way of doing, and it's part of this track 2, track 1 merging together as well. When we talk about track 1 being ministers and so on, and then there is a parallel track 2, but here you are bringing together track 1 and track 2. Of academicians, thinkers, researchers, diplomats, along with political leaders. So there is that osmosis also that is engendered by this Raisina Dialogue.
Even outside Raisina Dialogue,
yes,
you spoke about track 1 and track 2. New Delhi has become in many ways a melting pot of ideas.
Yes.
India has emerged as one of these, at least a leader of the global south. And apart from that, we had foreign ministers of US and Russia both here, openly speaking,
yes,
sharing their ideas.
Yes.
Something similar happened last year as well,
right,
in the same months. So how do you see this emergence of a new vibrant India globally, a new foreign policy, and also, as Prime Minister Modi reflected at the Bali summit, he said, this is not an era of war.
Yes.
And that phrase has been quoted globally.
Again in the communique of the foreign ministers now.
So how do you see this?
No, that indeed is the new India assuming its role and responsibility and demonstrating its capabilities in different areas, and how that has come together to position it to play a balancing role, to play a bridging role. Today the world is riven as almost going back to the Cold War days. We are talking about a Cold War 2.0, and you see it in the UN Security Council, the paralysis there. You have P3 versus P2, and unfortunately the unreformed UN Security Council does not have balancing third pole like India, and should be there. So, I think we have to continue to prove on the ground that we are there to deliver the global public goods that the UN and the multilateral system is seeking to deliver, whether it is peace and security, whether it is sustainable development goals, climate action and environmental protection. We are taking leads in that. Humanitarian assistance and disaster response, we are in the forefront. So, I think apart from all the other eligibility factors for us to be a leading power, to be a part of the global governance structure, I think our showing by doing is very important, and that is what we have been doing, and that is being recognized.
Right.
In fact, all the participants again in my panel, they were saying that. I think he began by asking me that question, the confidence of India coming up on stage, and also taking responsibility.
You touched upon a very important topic, which was going to be my next question, and which is on UN reforms. We are talking about an India which is one of the most populous countries in the world.
Absolutely.
It is the 5th largest economy, growing higher every day, every week, every month. We are talking about an India which is taking an independent position, not surrendering to any kind of bullying anymore. And isn't it time that India should be in the UNSC? And secondly, UNSC without India, do you think that it will continue to remain incompetent and perhaps a dysfunctional body?
Absolutely, that's the case I make all the time, and I think India makes. But it's not only about India. It's what's good for the world. It's what's good for peace and security, which the UN is supposed to deliver. It's becoming irrelevant. Wars are being fought. Peace without the UN being able to prevent. Prevention was supposed to be one of the big projects that the new Secretary General, when he took over in 2016, I believe, he said, this is my priority. But whether it is prevention, whether it is conflict resolution, whether it is peacekeeping and peace building, the UN is handicapped severely by the fact that the UN Security Council, which is the control room, the war room, the cockpit, whatever you may call it, of this whole peace and security project of humanity, is first of all being run by a group of 5 countries who were victors of the Second World War. But since then the world has changed. 193 countries are now members of the UN. 5 billion people are not represented as permanent members. They are left out. And 3 continents and also small island developing states, set aside that, but even continents of Latin America, Asia and Africa are not represented. So, we really need, it's unconscionable on one side that there should be no representation of such a large chunk of humanity in this project and in the governance of that project. But at the same time, it is also an issue of efficacy and effectiveness, what we bring to the table, as much as our right to be at the table. and what is right, but it's also the smart thing to do for the world to have India at the table. So, I think this expansion issue has to be nailed, and this is something I'm hoping that this crisis, the two crises that we have seen UN at 75 face, one is the COVID-19 crisis, which was again a World War III type of crisis that the world faced, and now you have the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which is also teetering on one side. The people are talking about also leading up to a wider conflagration of a World War III, but also about nuclear Armageddon. So, at a time like this, we really hope that the shake-up happens and the world decides, even those who have the veto and who don't want to surrender it, that they decide that yes, we need that this UN Security Council, the UN system for peace and security is broken, we need to recreate. And that is why India has proposed, I believe, that there should be this whole concept of norm, the new orientation for a reformed multilateralism. And when we were president, we had the presidency of the UN Security Council last year. And now there is to be a conference, I believe, called the Summit of the Future in 2024. And preparatory to that, in September 2023, there is to be discussions on how we get there, and that summit is to adopt a new agenda for peace, if you will. But what new agenda for peace can you adopt unless you have meanwhile not only decided, but worked to reform the UN Security Council, to expand it. It's been pending for 30 years. So, this is something that has to be attended to.
Speaking about the UN reforms, one important area where India has faced a challenge continuously and where the UN has continuously failed is on defining terrorism. And the convention that India had brought in has been pending for years and years together.
Absolutely.
Why do you think that the United Nations has not been able to find a consensus on terrorism when terrorism has emerged in the last 2 decades as a global problem? We've seen what happened in Afghanistan, we've seen the 9/11 attacks, the 26/11. What will shake the conscience of the UN to bring a consensus?
Well, I think there has been a strengthening of a more robust attention to the whole issue of counter-terrorism in the UN in the last few years. The whole the US and the West had become very very what shall I say, I won't say aggressive, but very very pushy on this agenda. But now there is a slight shift, if not quite a lot of shift, in the focus on terrorism, because other issues have taken over. And what is there are both structural problems and political issues. You mentioned the convention. The convention has been held hostage on issues, fundamental issues like the definition of who is a terrorist, on terrorism, and the old divides, political divides prevail on that. There are certain countries who would not like the definition to be too wide, some others would want it to be limited. So, there are many issues that have held up this convention despite India's pushing it. But meanwhile, there is an architecture for counter-terrorism that has been set up, and in that, as part of that, there is this UNCCT, which is a the secretariat for, and then there is the UN Security Council's committee on counter-terrorism, and you have a secretariat, the CTED, supporting that. So, we have these structures which was not there before. So, there is an improvement, but it is you are absolutely right, it is insufficient. You have problems like, first problem which I was going to, in fact today I did not get the opportunity, but I was going to highlight, was that it is entirely voluntarily funded. So, these institutions are donor driven, and the narrative set are therefore also very much driven by the donors. The other aspect is that in the sanctions committee, and this is something that has been mentioned in the G20 communique of foreign ministers as well, that in the sanctions committee there is a tendency of certain countries to make political determinations on who is a terrorist, who is not a terrorist, who should be sanctioned, who should not be sanctioned. And recently there was this resolution about exempting on the financing issue, financing of terrorism issue, exempting groups that are doing humanitarian work. So, we have to try and keep the faith with this issue, which is central, as you rightly said, to global peace and security. It is not my problem alone or your problem alone. And the old divide of your terrorist is my militant or freedom fighter. No, it is not like that. And I think there is now enough, including in the strategies that are adopted in the UN every 2 years, there is enough to indicate that terrorism is not acceptable on any grounds.
One final question, ma'am. India has taken over the G20 presidency, and we've been speaking about the foreign affairs ministers meeting. But how can India take advantage of this? We have a series of meetings, a lot of talk, a lot of narrative about how vibrant this conference is and how people are looking forward to the summit and the side meetings that are happening from Jammu and Kashmir to Northeast to all across India. So, how can India take advantage of this?
Well, it's a once in a 20-year opportunity for India to be that global leader and a citizen, global citizen, to deliver for the global south, but also to the world, and contribute in terms of the various issue areas that have been identified by India as priorities. And they include how do we, and because G20 represents, as we all know, 85% of the GDP of the world. These are the major economies. So, and they focus on economic and financial governance issues, coordination issues, consultation on how to make the world better for everyone through economic and financial actions and arrangements. So, in that context, India has identified 6 major themes, amongst which include SDGs, financing of SDGs, the whole area of life, the lifestyle for environment initiative of the Prime Minister, which is really about sustainable consumption and production, and each one making a contribution as much as creating an ecosystem, market signals that would then promote this life movement and make it a Janda Andolan. And then the climate finance issue, which has been at the heart of our moving to, especially for the developing world, to make the transition to a green economy and also to decarbonize. So, India is trying to push the envelope on getting climate finance, climate related technology, green technology, to get the international community and particularly the North to deliver on their promises of resources and to get more specific and concrete about what can be done, how to proceed further on that. And then there is this whole issue of the 21st century multilateralism, and in that context also how can the world cope with the consequences of the war and even before that the post-COVID recovery. We are still recovering, the world is, and on top of that came this the 3F crisis, food, fuel and fertilizer crisis. So how can multilateral institutions like the IMF and World Bank, how can they come forward and support both SDG financing, climate financing, but also how can this 3F crisis for those most in need be resolved. So all of these issues are very much in one of my articles I talked about this being the worst of times and the best of times.
Yeah.
And in that context, India has a role. Prime Minister has been talking about healing. Prime Minister has been talking about the spirit of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and one earth, one family and one future. I think that's very important. Absolutely. This concept of one future, and at a time when there is division, fragmentation, and inward looking ethos. So I think we have a very important role to play and an opportunity. And of course, I don't think any presidency has taken it so seriously.
Absolutely.
And so much to heart, and with such tan man dhan laga ke, that our presidency has, and I think it will stand out as a historic presidency, and I really hope for all success. We have challenges, as I said, the world is riven in so many different ways, but we do hope that we can pull off some miracles.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.